Good evening, everybody. We're going to have some time for folks to come into the webinar, but welcome. Hope everyone's having a wonderful day. Going to give it about a minute or so. Phoenix, we had our first 100-degree day the other day, so it's going to be a warm summer, it feels like. As long as it's not as terrible as last summer, I'll be happy. All right, I think we're just going to go ahead and get started. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Joe Mar Hooper. I am the proud CEO here at Third Decade, and I'm just so excited to have a wonderful group of folks who are going to be here with us today to talk a little bit about all things family and finance as we jump off the first day of our Alumni Week. So we really wanted to have a chance as a part of our Alumni Week for folks who've graduated from Third Decade or our current participants to be able to ask some questions and get some answers to some things that are really burning up inside as they go through our program, as they start to experience financial success. And family and finance being one of the major topics that we heard from, we have a wonderful panel of experts that we want to just introduce you to soon, but they're going to provide us with some great background on what they do, specifically around family and finance, and be able to answer all the questions that we've come up with. So as we get started, just a couple ground rules I want you guys to think about. And just as we get started, so drop your name and location in the chat if you can, so we can get an idea and flavor of who we have here and where you're located at. And specifically when you went through Third Decade, or if you're currently still in Third Decade. So drop that into the chat and let us know. A couple other pieces that we want to talk about. Feel free to use the chat throughout the conversation as well, too. If something piques your interest or something, a eureka moment, feel free to hit the chat and share your experience or your thoughts with the other folks who are going to be on the webinar with us as well, too. But that's just for the chat. For questions that come up, we're going to have a moment for question and answering later. There's a Q&A button. Feel free to leave your questions in that Q&A. We're going to try and get to as many questions as we can after that as well, too. So before we get started, just really wanted to start by thanking our sponsors for this week, CLA Accountants, Pima Federal Credit Union, and Umpqua Bank. It's because of their generosity we're able to sponsor this week and able to get some great things moving for our alumni and for our participants. So now it's time to meet our amazing participants. So we have three wonderful folks who know a lot. They've forgotten more about this subject than I know, so I'm excited to introduce them. I'm going to start with Natasha Carrillo. Natasha is a financial educator and holds a master's in education technology. She is the co-host of Black and Brown Make Green, a financial empowerment podcast that she hosts with her husband, Damien. Her mission is to educate and inspire others to manage their money with confidence. As a financial educator, Natasha brings her experience as a former K-5 instructional coach and elementary school teacher, experiences that have instilled in her a love for sharing knowledge and the ability to simplify complex topics. Natasha's the mom of two active young boys, and in her spare time, you can find her gardening, hiking, building with Legos, or out on other active adventures with her family. And two fun facts. Natasha grew up in the country raising pigs, and she's a three-time state of Texas powerlifting champion. Say hi, Natasha.
Hello, everyone.
Next, we have Kelly Klingeman. Kelly is the founder and financial planner of the independent fee-only RIA firm, Kelly Klingeman Financial Planning. She provides ongoing financial planning and investment management help to busy professional women and dual career couples, particularly those working in finance, engineering, and tech, or receiving equity compensation. Before founding KKFP, she spent nearly 12 years building a career in the investment management industry at Dimensional Fund Advisors, a large asset manager whose long-term approach to investing relies on financial science instead of attempting to guess where markets are going next, and they're a partner of Third Decade. Most recently, Kelly was a regional director and vice president on the sales team and lead chair of the Women Inclusion Network for Employees. Kelly received a degree in finance from the University of Texas at Austin McComb School of Business and also holds the Certified Financial Planner and Registered Life Planner designations. She volunteers to mentor undergraduate business students at her alma mater, most recently via the Wealth Management Center mentorship program. Kelly focuses on mentoring young women interested in becoming financial advisors one day. Besides mentorship, Kelly has been an active member of the Volunteer with Texas Wall Street Women's Austin chapter since 2014, planning network and educational events for members and supporting the organization's long-standing partnership with the Young Women's Preparatory Network. Say hi, Kelly.
Oh, unmute. Hi, everyone.
And last but not least, we have Scott Middlesworth. Scott has been a CFP for over 30 years, and he has worked in various areas of the tax and financial industry, but concentrated in employee benefits and insurance consulting. He lives in North Carolina with his wife Renee and their two spoiled dogs, Tux and Lulu, and he has two adult children who finally moved out a couple years a couple years ago. Say hi, Scott.
Good evening, everybody.
Good. So now that you know our wonderful panel, we're going to jump into the first question. And the first question is going to be aimed at Natasha. So for our alumni, our third decaders, and current participants that are at the age where they are thinking about starting a family, what are some of the major considerations they should be taking into account in that process?
Yeah, so if you're thinking about starting a family, there's a lot that you could be thinking about. I think there's probably three most important things to focus on. One would be the health insurance for the birthing partner. And if both partners are working, you might want to examine which health insurance is most favorable for that birthing partner to be on. I know when I got pregnant with my first son, I was on my own insurance, but towards the end of the pregnancy, I had switched over to my husband's. And so I ended up getting like $2,000 in refunds because his insurance was so much better than mine. So definitely looking into the health insurance for the birthing partner. And then the second thing would be life insurance, just because you never know what is going to happen. And you're probably at one of your healthiest moments if you're getting ready to start a family. And so having that life insurance in place before the kids come and things get crazy is a really important step, I think, in order to think about. And then the third thing is really thinking about how your income and your expenses are going to change once you start that family. So for some people, you decide that one partner is going to stay at home. So that's going to definitely change your income. So you definitely want to think about if there's going to be any change in your income because a partner stays at home or because the partner decides to work part-time or work less hours than before. And then the changing expenses, you really need to think about that because once you have a child, if that child is going to go into daycare, you've got that added expense of daycare. And uh, when the child is an infant, that tends to be the most expensive time that they are in daycare. And so, one thing you might consider doing is how can we create a budget to include that in your budget now before the child even gets there. So you can kind of live on that budget of, okay, this is what it's going to feel like when we have to pay for that daycare so that you can have an idea of if it's going to be tight for you. And then also, if you tend to do that, you start saving before the baby comes, you've got a savings built up that can be used for baby expenses or extra time off for the mom or the dad or both of you. So I think those are three of the big things to consider.
So, as a part of that too, Natasha, so that's what about folks who've recently had children and are kind of experiencing some of those growing pains as a part of a new family that they already have?
I would say lean on your network. Being a new parent is a really hard transition sometimes for people. So lean on the people around you to help you out and to give you a break if needed. I know in my neighborhood, we've got families who will trade babysitting time. So like I'll babysit your kids so you and your spouse can get some time alone and we'll switch on another day. So I would say number one, lean on your network. And then also recognize that you're in a phase of your life that doesn't last forever. Even if it is a difficult time, like understand that it's fleeting, it's something that you're going to get through, and you just work through it as best as you can during that time, and then you'll pick right up as soon as you get into a groove.
Awesome. Thank you, Natasha. Question number two, and we're going to throw this one over to Kelly. So, you see a lot of different things about relationships on IG and TikTok, and despite what we see some of those times, many of the folks in our age range at third decade are indeed in relationships. So, what is some guidance you would offer when it comes to partially or fully financially combining their lives with their long-term partner? And are there any best practices you want to share around that?
Yes, I think it's very hard when you are combining finances with someone in general. I think of like each of my husband and myself, we come from very different money backgrounds, and it's this bringing together of two different people's money stories and how you save and spend money. So just going into that, know that it's going to take some time, and you should try it with little steps and not rush into some big changes. Um, I had the benefit of, I got married really early before I really made money. So my husband and I just decided to combine everything together from the beginning. But as I've been working with clients, I know that's not necessarily very realistic, especially if you come from being independent, making your own money, and then combining things with someone after you get married. So I would say at the very least, one of the best practices I encourage for the clients I work with is to do an exercise to where you can understand what your shared expenses are and open a joint checking account where you're pooling money to pay for those joint expenses. So starting there, not combining everything, but at least combining maybe proportionally what you each bring into the household, or maybe you decide to split it 50-50. I have a few clients where, one of the partners makes kind of 60% of the household income and one makes more like 40%. So they proportionally will add a certain amount of money to a joint checking account that then pays for their shared expenses. And I also like the concept of yours, mine, and ours accounts, where you still kind of keep things separate as you're making this transition. So you've got the ours shared account that pays for shared expenses. And then perhaps you still have your own individual checking accounts that pay for other things that don't really have anything to do with each other, that are more particular to you as a person. I think once you have kids, thinking about the last question, once you start to have kids, if that's something you choose to do and is able to happen, more and more of that gets thrown into the joint bucket. But I do like the idea of still having some autonomy and having your own bucket of money. This also makes me think of more complicated topics, just along the lines of, depending on where you live and if you do decide to get married, just because you have separate accounts, it may still all be considered kind of community property. And just because, oh, well, it's in my own account, so it's mine. So if something were to happen, I get to take that with me. That's not necessarily the case. So I do think it's also good to consider just discussing that. I've got some clients that, they enter into like a prenup situation when certain things are involved because they're trying to protect certain assets. So I won't get into all of those details, but prenups, postnups, those are all things that I've been seeing these days when it comes to kind of shoring up what we're going to have together and then protecting what needs to be kept separate. But simple exercise of understanding your shared expenses and having that paid for out of a joint account. And then also looking at getting a joint high yield savings account for shorter term savings. And then even moving on to like a joint brokerage account for that midterm, bigger investment savings. I think those are all steps that I encourage people to take once they combine finances.
Good. Kelly, just one quick follow-up. I know there could be a lot of kind of fear involved in that process of combining those finances and moving in that first step to take that joint account. Any quick advice that how to get over that fear when it comes to that?
Yeah. I think having regular like money date conversations with your partner is really important. I'm thinking of like very close friends of mine who are kind of trying to do this right now. They're actually working with like a money coach too. It's not someone that does maybe a more detailed work like what I do, but kind of meeting on a regular basis and having a shared space where they can moderate a conversation between the two people as they talk through kind of, hey, well, here's how I would like us to spend our money this week. And of course, you don't always agree on those things. So as in all things, communication is really important when it comes to money decisions. So you need to kind of talk about it early and often. And you're not necessarily going to agree. I think it's coming to some sort of compromise, though, and understanding that a lot of things are shared now. So what you got to decide independently is not necessarily what's going to work now when you're in the shared relationship. And so understanding that each of you needs to compromise on some things in order to have more success as a couple in the short term and in the long term. So regular conversation, regular communication, and get the help of some sort of, whether it's a therapist or a financial money coach or even, a more advanced financial advisor. They can help create a space to facilitate healthy conversation around money.
Great, thank you. I know my wife and I, we started what's called the budget committee. We meet and have our conversations around that committee structure. So it's kind of one unique way to kind of do it.
Yeah.
All right, next question. So this is for Scott. So we hear many stories of our participants having to start the discussion with their parents on elder care. Can you talk about what it looks like for some of your clients that are dealing with that? What are some major things to understand when planning or financially thinking about taking care of older parents?
Well, this did actually happen to me personally, and I've had many, many friends where we had to start becoming the parent. But also when we're a parent to our own kids, it's interesting we're having a discussion about having kids, and what eventually could happen is you become the sandwich generation where you're sandwiched between your kids and your parents, depending on what the situation is. What I recommend for people to do is, depending on where they are in the process with their parents. Their parents may be, you know, perfectly independent. I know the parents will not willingly want to discuss this topic. It is a very, very difficult topic to discuss with their children about, because the first thing they're going to think is, you're going to throw me into a nursing facility. This actually even happened with my wife when discussing power of attorney with her mother. That was exactly what she thought. Literally said that. And so it's a very emotionally charged topic. And there are a lot of options for care. But what you would want to look at is, what do your parents want? And also, what do you want? Because they don't think it's going to affect anybody but themselves. And, they're going to try to stay home. And there are a lot of options about aging in place. But words to use or words to think about would be frailty. Is that if somebody is, if you ask parents, are you planning a long retirement? Well, they probably are. And are they planning with their financial planner maybe into mid 80s, 90s for their retirement plan? Well, great. Frailty comes with that. Maybe lack of independence. Of course, it can be a very quick, maybe accident that causes it, where somebody may need care. But one of the issues that goes along with this being sandwiched, also being the spouse having to maybe care for a frail, aging, Alzheimer's, dementia type patient, is depression. It's a very emotional issue for both the parents and the children, or the adult children. But it is one thing to start discussing is, as we've said about learning about your potential spouse, and having money talks with your spouse, is start to have money talks with your parents. Do they have long-term care insurance? What assets do they have? What do they want to have happen? Do they have wills? Do they have trusts? Those kind of things. Because eventually you may be the one who will be in charge of that.
Thank you, Scott. I think that conversation is super important. I know I've had to have that with my parents, and it's not easy to ask them where the documents are just in case, or things of that nature, right?
It is not. And, also there is also the protection of parents. I've mentioned this to the panel before, that my father, who was one of the most skeptical people I've ever met in life, was scammed out of a bit of money, not that much money, but a typical scam, calling up and trying to help. And so it's protection of parents both physically, but also protection of the assets, and getting access to maybe at least being able to see what's going on in their bank accounts. Especially for parents who are not computer savvy, would be important, I think, also.
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott. So back to you, Natasha. So I'm an old man. I have two kids in college right now. So this is a totally different conversation than what I had when I was thinking about when they were younger, right? But for new or prospective parents that are dealing with their own financial security concerns, how do they begin to think about saving for their children's future college expenses? It's a tough thing to think about, right? And how should this be prioritized amongst their other financial goals?
I think this is really hard for a lot of people, especially people who have had student loans, because they know what it's like to have those student loans and how difficult it can be to pay them off and to deal with them. So I think a lot of parents who may have had student loans want to make sure that their kids don't get into that same situation. But it's so important for the parents to really take care of themselves first. Because, like with Scott talking about, as you are aging, you want to be able to financially support yourself. And if you haven't taken care of yourself first, then that is going to fall onto your kids. And so, even if you want to provide for their college, I would say first, take a look at your own retirement system that you have in place and if you're on track to reach your retirement goals first. And then once you are on track with that, then you can think about the ways for saving for your college. But then also, there are so many scholarships available. I know I have a cousin graduating from high school and he just received a full ride scholarship from a university. So and he knew that his job was to apply for scholarships. So like every week, that is his job. So I think if that is the idea going in as your kids become of graduation age, that they know like scholarships is how we want to fund college, then that's a great way for you to be able to focus on you having the retirement money that you need while also still helping your kids to have the money that they need for college too. So I would say prioritize yourself first, put your own oxygen mask on first is what you'll hear a lot of people say. And then, once you're established, if you can, then you can contribute to your kids' college stuff.
Yeah, I want to second that idea about the scholarships. There are just so many resources nowadays for scholarships that I've been. I made my daughters, like you said, that was their job. Come home from school, apply for scholarships. So that was a big deal for us as far as them being able to capture some really great dollars for college. So that's a great tip. Thank you. So Kelly, so one thing we teach about in third decade is this idea of the hedonic treadmill. So we teach that in our class, and why you should not try to keep up with the Joneses. So can you talk about the larger picture importance of fighting against lifestyle creep?
Yeah, I think it's really hard for us who kind of grew up with social media and it's now such a big piece of our lives to realize that a lot of what we see and like how people might be spending their money is really just a facade. And I have to try to remind my own clients who, they've got great jobs, they make great money, and they still fall victim to feeling like they don't have enough sometimes because we've got this device in our hand that shows us people's highlight reel of their lives all the time. I like doing there's a lot of really good books on this or kind of going through the exercise of life planning in general, where it teaches us to focus more on what we truly value and aligning our money with what we truly value. And I think those types of exercises, values-based planning, values-based spending can help us fight against lifestyle creep. Just because we're making more money, we don't want to keep spending more. We don't try and keep our expenses to just what really serves us and what truly aligns with our values. So I think it's an awareness of our spending. I am not a big fan of strict budgeting, but I at least like to categorize things in 3 broad buckets. Like, what does our fixed spending look like? What's our variable lifestyle weekly choices look like? And then more of our non-monthly spending, have the bigger things. and checking in on that a few times a year and making sure that how we're spending is aligned with what we truly care about. And if we're noticing things in our spending, our transactions that kind of make us feel like, oh, why did we spend that money? At least that awareness can help us to, of course, they're not going to be perfect, but keep us more on track of focusing on what we can control in our own lives and putting blinders on to what we see other people doing. Because in all honesty, when you see people buying fancy things, they're most likely buying it with money that they don't have. You hear a lot of like studies about this, like people buying, fancy cars, fancy houses and things. And like stealth wealth is actually more people that are wealthy behind the scenes, and they're not necessarily showing that off with their types of materialistic purchases. So that's a good reminder for me personally to kind of remember, like, all right, I need to tune out a lot of that noise and focus on why I'm saving. So having an awareness of your spending and then plotting out your short-term, mid-term, and longer-term savings goals, and having certain like high yield savings accounts and investment accounts that are aligned with those savings goals, because I think when we're seeing those balances grow over time, that's really encouraging to us, and it helps us think like, oh, we're getting closer to those bigger, more important goals. And that can also help curb unnecessary spending that tends to lead to lifestyle creep. So a lot of values-based planning, focusing on what really truly serves you and brings you joy, and that awareness, you can get really good at avoiding the type of spending that just really kind of brings us down and is wasteful and materialistic in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm looking at the poll as well too. So, this is the problem that we all have, right? Lifestyle creep. Although I'm not heavy on social media, I know one thing I deal with is things. Sometimes you just want things, whether it's a nostalgic thing or whatever. You have to, I don't need that Super Mario Nintendo thing, but it was in my childhood, right? Can I get that? So I think that's something a lot of folks are dealing with, just the idea of things as well too.
Well, and I think too, that's a good point, right? Like, I'm really into buying physical books, and that doesn't necessarily like my husband's like, why do you need this? You can read it on your Kindle. But I find a lot of joy in like collecting books and displaying them. And I've decided that that's my thing, and I want to focus on that. I've got like a library that we built, and but that's not for everyone, but it is something that brings me joy. So I think it is just finding what it is that you value, and it's okay if it's something that is materialistic, but then narrowing in on that and cutting down in other areas that you find don't really serve you and don't really bring you a lot of joy. And I think that can be helpful. So again, it's just like an awareness of how we're spending money and putting boundaries in place. Automating your savings so that you don't have leftover cash sitting there to spend is also another thing that I like to do personally for myself. Like the cash just isn't there, so I can't spend it. And just being really mindful of how you use your credit card too, because that's where people can spend money again that they don't necessarily have.
Absolutely. And you see my bookcase, I have video games and basketball stuff. I need more books. So next question. So Scott, this is probably a tough one, right? Unfortunately, divorce and separation can be a fact of life, as we touched on. In what ways should people prepare themselves up front for the possibility of divorce? And what are some considerations for those going through it and starting over currently?
This, as I mentioned to the panel before, unfortunately, I went through this myself. And man, I'm getting all the downer questions, aren't I? The divorce and going into a nursing home, that kind of thing. But like like we've already discussed, if think you're going into divorce, separation, or the like, is being an active participant, meaning know what's going on financially in life. Don't be, I mean, this is kind of goes back in time of the maybe the husband where they handled everything, handled all the finances. All of a sudden, it came to either death or divorce, and the spouse was just completely, totally lost, didn't even know where anything was. And of course, that was before computers, and um, there was lack of information. So one of the things I was actually talking with my wife about this, And I said, one of the things that I would do, and it, excuse me, I actually did for my wife before we got married, was give her a credit report of mine. So if you're going down the road of divorce or separation, and maybe you haven't done this seems like an intrusive question, but you need to do a credit report on yourself, on your spouse, on any joint accounts, and do a check and see, do are there liabilities out there you do not know about? Is everything on the table? Are there assets you don't know about? Um, of course, you also need to become knowledgeable of your state laws, whether it's a community property state or not, because that plays into things as to whether one person brought the debt or was it debt that was incurred during the marriage. So there's naturally, one of the first things I would recommend is going and talking to an attorney and learning what are your rights as a spouse. What are your responsibilities? And very much trying to keep a level head through the whole thing. Because I've seen situations where a spouse was so mad about the situation, either they go out and buy a ton of stuff, or um, it- you know, just start spending all over the place. One thing and they don't think about, oh, this could wreck both our credits. And that's the thing, to have a mature conversation about debt and assets. And, the income and assets may not be exactly equal. What generally will happen is the person who has a greater income may have less assets. And it's meant to be an equal distribution. But um, what I've generally seen over my life and in my career is somebody is either extremely passive or they're extremely, a bull going, I'm going to take everything. I'm going to win, and neither of those serve the situation well. So it is getting good advice, trying to be level-headed about it. Get your people around you that can give you good advice and keep you kind of in your lane. But it is, having your goals and speaking to a qualified attorney about what you should and should not do.
Great. Thank you, Scott. So many of those that bought homes before the pandemic, they're in good position, right? They have very, very low interest rates, but some are feeling trapped in those homes now, as buying only a slightly higher in value house can cost a ton more, just the way things have been inflated. So this makes it challenging for those who feel their family has outgrown their current home. So, Natasha, what are some of the things that these folks in that situation should take into consideration?
So I actually felt like I had outgrown my home a couple of years ago, back in 2020. This was before the interest rates went up, but I started thinking, oh, we need a playroom so the kids will have a designated place to play, and we need another office space. And so we started looking at homes, and the home that we were looking at was, much more than the home that we live in right now. And so what we started thinking about was, do we really need this home, or can we rearrange our home that we already live in to make it work for us? And what it really came down to was we didn't need that. And it probably was some of that lifestyle creep that Kelly was talking about earlier, of like, oh, this person has a playroom and this person has that, so we need that too. You tend to feel like you need more as your family grows, but that's not always necessarily the case. So I would say number one, to really ask yourself, is there a way for us to readjust the living space in our own home to make it work for us? And in my case, that's exactly what we did. We bought some more organizational tools. We decided we don't need a dining room because nobody's using it anyway. So dining room becomes a playroom. So it's really getting creative with the space that you already live in, number one, before you go out and make another purchase. Because and the other things to consider is you're not just getting a new mortgage and a higher mortgage possibly, but you're also getting higher expenses because a bigger home, you're going to have a bigger electricity bill, a bigger water bill, and a bigger insurance bill. So all of those expenses are going to be way more than you may have expected going in. So I'd really consider, like, is it necessary for you to move into a bigger place, or is it just that you need to paint the bathroom wall to make it look nicer for you to want to be there? So those are some things that I would say to consider in that situation.
Thank you. And our poll is showing that interest rates, that a lot of folks are dealing with that currently as well too. It's a big deal in our country right now.
Mhm.
All right. So with the cost of childcare increasing, what are the pros and cons of using an FSA towards dependent care costs, Kelly?
Yes, I was just logging in with someone today and we were looking at her childcare, dependent care FSA money. And it's something I usually encourage, like if it's something offered through your employer, a lot of times employers will offer this as part of your employee benefits package where you can set up a dependent care flexible spending account or FSA. And I think these are great. I think currently you can put up to $5,000 into these pre-tax and use it toward the cost of childcare. And it usually has a more of a benefit, especially once you start earning more money and you get past a certain threshold to utilize something like this. The cost of childcare is, for my clients that have young kids, which is most of them, it's as much as or more than their mortgage, especially if they have more than one child in childcare. In the city of Austin, for one kid to go to childcare, it can be, 15 to 20 grand a year. So of course, $5,000 in a flexible spending account for dependent care chips away at a little of that, which is nice. And you can essentially like pay yourself back from this. You do want to be mindful of the deadline to use this money. I've seen people forget that they have it. So a con of these types of accounts is they have a deadline at the end of the year where you have to take the money out and pay yourself back and use it. So that's one of the big things, is make sure you're paying attention to whether or not there's money in there. You've got to use it by the end of the year. And you have to have receipts to show what you're using this money for. So if you're paying for daycare, you have to have proof of the invoice and everything. You usually have to upload that into the system before you can pay yourself back this money. So yeah, just being mindful that you don't leave any money on the table that you were putting in there, because at the end of the year, it does not roll over into the next year.
Good. And Kelly, we have a poll up that most of our participants on today do not have a flexible spending account. So I'm not sure if they don't have it at their employer, or they're not taking advantage of it. Can you just talk 2 seconds about the importance of maybe taking advantage of it if they do have it?
I think a lot of times people don't realize they have this as an option. I think I look at employee benefits packages a lot, and most of the clients I work with have this as an option, but I think people see it, they see FSA and they think healthcare. So the flexible spending account for healthcare, which there is a healthcare FSA account, which a lot of the clients I work with, we opt for a high deductible healthcare plan usually, which has a health savings account or HSA, and then you don't get to use an FSA. But I would read through those employee benefits packages closely, because I see these offered pretty often. It's very rare that I don't see it's usually called a dependent care FSA. And if you've got that in there, it's a really great option to opt for when you're signing up for your annual benefits package.
And just one tidbit about that: when my daughters were in elementary school, you can actually use it for after school care at some schools, and that was it wasn't a whole daycare thing. Just the time from them getting out of school to me getting off of work, I was able to use my dependent care expenses for that charge. It saved a lot of money for me. So think about it, guys.
Yeah.
And Scott, I totally apologize for this. You did say you're getting all of the downer questions, so we got one more downer question for you. Um, so,
Uh,
can you give us some thoughts and advice around when is the right time to begin planning and thinking about end of life? And a part of that, like, when should you be thinking about your documents? What should you think about when make sure your will won't be contested? And choosing an executor of your will as far as that too.
well, Dr. Doom, I guess that's my nickname tonight for um, well, like the elder care or senior care, whatever you term you want to use for aging parents, is it's a really all of it, even end of life, is a conversation about your loved ones, not so much about you. It's what do you want for your loved ones, and that's the way to approach the conversation. It's to make life easier on the people left behind. It's plain and simple. That it's not simple, but that is really the goal. It's not. We're not talking about death. We're talking about the people who would be living. That's the goal that you're trying to achieve.
Mhm.
But to begin planning for end of life, I'm actually shocked how many of my friends. I'm 61, and I had a friend who did not have a will, and one of my best friends, and I was just shocked that he did not. And he had children, and a divorce, and remarried, and I'm like, uh, you know, there's so many variables here that when you're looking at end of life, it's like, what do you want to have happen? What do you want to have happen for the people left behind? What do you want to have happen with your assets? Um, who do you want to care for your children? Who do you want to be your trustee? Who do you want to be executor? And I'll go in that in a second. Um, but there are several documents. A will is the most common a document that people are aware of. If you die without a will, you go what is called intestate, or you have died without a will, and the state will decide by intestate laws how your assets will be distributed based on whether you're married, your children, and the like, and the rules for your state. Um, these documents, if you're looking at if you're getting married, you need to do it then. Once you start having people in your life, um, you need to get a will. You need to get a power of attorney, durable health care power of attorney. These things are very easy to get. But when you start having children, when you start having assets, then you may want to consider something called a revocable living trust to really make your plans uh, that can outlive not only yourself, but they may outlive your spouse. It's like, what do you want to have happen way down the line? Um, and that goes into what should I do to ensure that my will not be contested. Well, a will can be contested. You can even put in a no uh, contesting clause, but that people can still contest it. A trust cannot be contested. So there's a big difference. And a trust, it doesn't have to be really complicated, but it makes life really easy for your survivors in the whole process of dealing with um, probate and a will. That it is a private process. A will and the probate process is a public process, and everybody will know exactly what's going on. Um, but doing things such as doing your will with an attorney, having it record, you're signing it, even doing it videotaped, to where it isn't ruled as a under duress, under some kind of influence, not able to make a sound judgment. But these documents should be revised or reviewed probably annually. Definitely, you need to revise these documents when there's been a marriage, not only marriage for you or kids, but what is going on with your children. That you need to be aware of how your planning can go down the line. And for how would I recommend choosing an executor or trustee? They're actually two different things. But the executor hopefully is a family member that can be fair and impartial. I have personally done this in my family. So it's not that somebody who is an executor gets to do anything they want. The heirs, if there are other heirs to the estate, can actually sue. So the executor is not only in a position of authority, they're in a fiduciary responsibility where they can be taken to court over uh, misuse of funds. So it is an important position, should be somebody that is trustworthy and close to either close to the family or can be an impartial person, such as a lawyer, something like that.
Good. Thank you for doing the heavy lifting on, on some of the tough conversations, Scott. We appreciate that. Now I think we have some time where we want to answer some of the burning questions that popped up in the Q&A. So you all's favorite third decader, I'm sure, Nikita Wolf, who you all know from our program, is going to kind of walk us through some of the questions that we have asked today.
Thanks, Jomar, and thank you all. You've done a great job answering the questions that the students submitted to us ahead of time. So we're not going to have time to get through all of them, but I'm going to choose some that I think are most relevant to the whole group. We'll start with this one. Could you talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the 529 college plan? And are there any disadvantages from a financial aid or scholarship perspective to having a lot of savings in one of these accounts?
Gonna throw that one, see if Kelly or Natasha have any thoughts on that one.
I have some thoughts. I was just meeting with a client about 529 accounts. Long story short, I don't think you should put too much money in a 529. I help my clients maybe save up to half the cost of college in a 529. And there's some great tools available to us as financial planners that, you know, if I believe my child to attend a 4-year in-state school in, you know, my oldest is 7 years old, you know, in the next, 10 years or so, you can pretty accurately know what that might cost based on the cost of college now and inflation. And that helps us determine how much I might want in a 529 account by the time she's 18. So of course, what if my daughter doesn't go to college and I've got all this money in this education savings plan? That's the real worry. There are, exceptions around scholarships. Like if you earn a certain amount, you can kind of take some of that out of the 529 without consequence. But my big thing is just don't put too much in it and maybe save in other vehicles, like just a brokerage account, and for the purpose of all other sorts of things you might want to help your kids with in the future if you've got the ability to do that. I live in the state of Texas, so with there being no state income tax here, we don't get a ton of benefit for putting money into a 529 account. It's more that once the money is in there, it grows in the stock market. And if we take it out and use it for our kids to go to college, the growth of that money is not taxed as long as it's used for educational purposes. So I love that, you're getting a little bit of a tax benefit, even in certain states with no state income tax. And then there are some states where you use the 529 and you get a tax break for putting money into the account too. It just depends. And that's why there's a 529 plan for every state, which makes lots of choices for us to look through. So I would say 50% or less the cost of college, maybe less. There are some great new rules in place that allow you to roll some of that money over into a Roth IRA for the benefit of the child, the beneficiary, which is great. I think it's at $36,000 that you can roll over into a Roth IRA, and if they don't happen to use that money. And it's good to see some of those rules coming into play, whereas a couple of years ago that was not the case. So So yeah, that's some of my thoughts on 529s.
Thank you, Kelly. All right, we have another one. What is an expense that expecting parents don't often think about?
I would say probably activities for your kids. I think people don't always think about all the things that kids have available to do to them these days. I mean, starting at the age of 2, kids have the option to be in soccer, to be in music lessons, piano lessons. There's just so many activities that your kids could be enrolled in. And I also think your environment can kind of make you feel like you need to put your kids into those things as well, which brings on an expense that you weren't necessarily expecting. So I think the activities that your kids could be involved in, because some of these leagues that your kids join can be very expensive depending on what they're into. So I think that's probably one of the expenses that a lot of parents don't really think about.
That's funny, Natasha. I heard a story the other day. There's about most young parents put their kids in these sports thinking they're going to get a scholarship. What if you have just invested the money that you spent into the sports? They could help pay for college, as most kids don't get a scholarship. So that's 100% on point.
Yeah, I was just pricing out just when your kids are in elementary school and they're off for the summer and you work full time, what do you do with your kids? And those of us who have elementary age children and you and your spouse both work, you're, at least in the city of Austin, you're starting to plan for the summer kind of at November, December, the year before, because camps go really quickly, especially the more affordable ones. And I've seen the cost of, let's say summer is 12 weeks long. You could be paying for like full-time care for kids outside of school with various camps anywhere from $150 a week. And that's probably only half, like a half-day camp. You're not paying for a full day, but like a full day, all week camp is probably around $300 to $400 a week. So for one child, it could be $4 to $5 grand for the entire summer. And that number just blows my mind. So that was one thing I personally was not as aware of. And then I think that to Natasha's point, you do the lifestyle creep makes me think of lifestyle creep. Like I've got to have my kid in all these different activities. You have got to tune out that noise. In all likelihood, they are not going to get a scholarship for a particular sport. I grew up a sports kid. I played volleyball. My husband played sports too. Like, I think it's important to play sports, but kind of try a few different things and don't feel like you need to put them in everything. Don't feel like they need to do travel sports when they're, in 3rd grade. They're going to have just as many opportunities as the next kid, even if they don't do those things, because those expenses I think can really, really add up. And you will feel the pressure from other families around you to keep adding, because you're like, well, I'm not giving my kid enough experience, and they're probably just gonna be just fine without all that extra activities and just being at home with you and that sort of experience too.
Absolutely.
It's a really good suggestion.
I'll just throw in one, braces. That one. Even with dental insurance through your employer, more than likely, almost 99% sure, it will not pay for all of it.
Yeah.
That is important.
Point. Thank you. All right, so how would somebody determine how much life insurance coverage they need? And does it depend on how many children they have?
I can speak to this one too a little bit. I usually recommend, most people I work with are dual career, so both spouses work and they both make pretty even amount of income for the household. And so one of the guidelines that you often see is look at term life insurance that is equal to 5 to 10 times your annual salary. And at least that gets you kind of in the ballpark of maybe what your term life insurance policy should be for. So if 5 to 10 times your salary is around $1 million, you get $1 million term life insurance policy. And you want to get it for the amount of time where your kids are going to still be dependents, or anyone is going to be dependent on you and your income. Because the idea is, well, if you were to pass away and your income does not exist for the household anymore, that term life insurance policy will kick into place And you would get that amount of money to replace your lost income. And that's going to pay for kids' activities and school and daycare, and then hopefully help them go to college and just any sort of expenses related to childcare, but also just related to running your household. So paying your mortgage, paying your insurance premiums for the car and the house, paying the car payment. You just have to imagine that if your income wasn't there and your spouse had to then pay for everything themselves, could their income cover that? Maybe, maybe not. Even in some of the families I work with that have a stay-at-home parent, there is value that they bring into the household, extreme value a lot of times, if they are the person running the household and taking care of the kids. And so I have a client couple where the husband is a physician and the wife stays home. And he works nights, he works all the time. So we had to talk about like, well, if she wasn't there and he has this very demanding schedule, he's probably going to have to pay for nanny, people to come in and clean the house, all these sorts of things that she was doing otherwise. So even a stay-at-home parent, there is a value to the type of work that they provide for the household. So even a policy that's like $500,000 to maybe even $1 million for someone that stays home, that could be reasonable for some people's situations.
Great point.
And if I could just add on to that, Nikita, when I got life insurance for myself and my husband, I was that stay-at-home parent. And I think it can be hard to put a number on, well, how do you put a number for a stay-at-home parent? And just to share how I thought about it, I thought about like, what do I want this life insurance money to do for my family? And at the time, I had one child and I wanted to be able to give my husband some time off of work. So I wanted enough to cover 2 years' salary for him. And then I also wanted enough to be able to pay off our house so that if I were gone, that's an expense that he didn't have to worry about. So when we were coming up with our number, it was how much is it going to take to pay off the house? How much is it going to take for you to at least have 2 years of salary to just take time off, to grieve and to get back into a groove. So I think it really comes down to thinking about what do you want that life insurance money to do for your family when you're gone, just to add a little bit to what Kelly was saying.
Yeah, those are great additions. We'll move on to our last question. That is, do you have any advice for those of us who have been denoted as an executor for our family members?
One thing I would recommend, and I've actually got a book right over here, is read up on it. Learn what your legal responsibilities are. If you are, learn where all the assets are while people are alive. That, especially, I mean, I have, my father is 95 years old, and I have life insurance policies from the 1930s. Pieces of paper. Now, the pieces of paper aren't necessary anymore, and the insurance companies have been bought and sold who originally had it 4 or 5 times. So the job can become almost an archaeological dig of trying to figure out where and what everything is. And even doing things like researching things with the state, is money owed to this person? There's a lot of different things. That's not necessarily required by an executor, but you want to know what are you getting into. And the more prepared you are up front, it it may be a little morbid trying to do that preparation up front, but it can really help to make your life easier down the road. And I will say that people at a courthouse, at the clerk of court, can be amazingly helpful if you need help in that area. Of course, talking to an attorney, getting guidance there is also highly recommended. But I would definitely read up on what you're getting into.
Thank you. That's going to go ahead and conclude the Q&A section of tonight, and Jomar's going to go ahead and close this out.
Absolutely. So we did have some questions that we didn't get to. So our goal is going to be to try over time to answer those questions and get a FAQ out to you guys around some of the stuff we talked about today. So sorry we couldn't get to everything, but we will try to answer those questions as we proceed as well. So as we wrap up, we have another webinar coming up tomorrow around entrepreneurship, and then we have a Q&A session on Thursday. So if you all are interested in coming to those, we would love to have you on those webinars as well too, to answer and ask some additional questions. And lastly, got to do a commercial for you guys. You know, our Q3 classes are going to be starting in July. So if you have family, friends, you are our best advertisement having gone through our program or are currently in our program. So spread the word, continue to spread the word, always spread the word around Third Decade. So we want to get as many folks in your lives into our program as possible. So I just really want to thank you all, Scott, Kelly, and Natasha, for joining us today. This was great. A lot of information was shared that's really going to help hopefully propel folks into some good conversations and into some good discussions. So thank you all for being a part of the panel today.
Yeah, thanks
Very
for
much.
having us.
Great. All right, everyone. We'll take care, and we'll hopefully see many of you tomorrow at the next session as well. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.